That's right, ladies and gentlemen. And to discuss India's role as a catalyst of peace, let me call upon stage Velina Tchakarova, geopolitical strategist and founder, Face for a Conscious Experience. Very warm welcome, ma'am. Also with us is Maria Ahmad Didi, former Minister of Defense of the Republic of Maldives. Very warm welcome to you. Joining us on the podium is also going to be Syed Akbaruddin, former permanent representative of India to the United Nations and Dean of Kautilya School of Public Policy. And of course, give it up for His Excellency Naur Gilon, Ambassador of Israel to India. Very warm welcome to you, sir. I would also like to request TV9 Network's Aditya Rajkal to moderate this session. Aditya, can we please have you on stage? Many thanks. Over to you.
Well, delighted to welcome you all here at the TV9 News 9 Global Summit. It's good to have you back here to discuss something that is very closely followed here in India and all across the globe. We're living in a time where Prime Minister Narendra Modi's words, "not an era of war," resonated not just at the SCO summit, but through the G20 as well, that took place not very far from here at the Bharat Mandapam in New Delhi. There was a consensus, an unthinkable consensus that really happened at the G20. Because I was there and the foreign policy wonks from all across the globe really hinted that this would be a disaster, just like what happened perhaps at Bali. But suddenly appeared Prime Minister Narendra Modi from nowhere on the very first day and said that a consensus had been achieved. Today, we discuss not an era of war, India as a global peace conflict, as a peace catalyst. And at the same time, we have to also understand and sink in this reality that we are living in a time when there are two simultaneous wars happening. There's been enough devastation after the 7th October terror attacks in southern Israel, in Gaza as well. And at the same time, with the statement from Ukraine, which said that 31,000 lives have been lost ever since the war 2 years ago. What is the end game for Russia? What is the end game for Israel here in this war? And of course, just like the Honorable Tony Abbott really mentioned a few minutes ago, that people are closely monitoring developments in Taiwan as well. Velina, let me come to you first. Well, you spoke recently at Raisina, you've spoken in Cape Town before this, and you've been observing developments in Europe very, very closely. We've had a situation where Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been speaking both to the Russian president and, of course, Zelensky from Ukraine. We've decided to have a very independent position to the shock of many in Europe. From the day one, if I could say so, they've been preaching India in many ways. And we've seen External Affairs Minister Jaishankar's remarks on this as well. But how do you see the situation developing now? And how do you see India's role in this new international order?
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure being here. Let me first outline very shortly how I see the, let's say, ongoing war. In my view, the war will continue at least up until 2025, 2026. We are going to face a new let's say, stage of escalation. This year, Russia has the upper hand. It is going to further mobilize. It has successfully bypassed Western sanctions, let's say to a great extent, even though that the West will introduce further packages. As we speak, just the 13th package was introduced by the European Union, apropos for the very first time also including an Indian company. And at the same time, actually, we've heard already from the speech of Mr. Abbott, the goal, the calculus of Russia is very clear what it is really about. It's first and foremost about, of course, Ukraine, and it is about the whole of Ukraine. So the longer the war lasts, the less of Ukraine will remain from Russia's position. That means that in a next step, they can move again against, let's say, the capital, Kiev, and they can try to seize more territory. But in the meantime, of course, they will be eyeing diplomatic negotiations. Why? Because this will legitimize already the controlled territories. Right now, they control around 17 to 18% of Ukraine's territory. They also want to legitimize Crimea as Russian one. So all we know, it is about the subjugation of the whole of Ukraine, but it is about more than that. Russia wants a new European security order. In fact, it wants to destroy the current security order, which has been more or less built up and settled for the last 30 years following the end of the Cold War. Russia wants a new game in which it could actually play off different European states against each other. It could have Russia-friendly governments, because we will have also elections, and at some point of time in the future, as you know, there will be economic repercussions, there will be greater geo-economic pain, and we have already actually a lot of things happening in terms of political forces, for instance, on the far right, but also on the far left, which pretty much actually side with the Russian position. But it is also about a new position of Russia in a new great game, in the long game, which is actually the new global order, where two forces, United States and China, are competing over the future of the global order. And here, Russia wants the pole position. Russia is a game changer. Russia has sided with China before making a move on Ukraine. And by siding with China, it has gotten also the comprehensive support. So what is India's stake here? First and foremost, India is going to bet on India. So it's going to try to take the best of the two worlds. In fact, I will argue that it is in all our interest to have a very strong India, geopolitically and geoeconomically, because this is probably the only bridge in the world right now trying to somehow balance two almost impossible, actually, partners. That is the West on the one side and Russia and China by extension on the other. So it is only India that is able to talk to all of these, relevant players and try to talk some sense, because of the worst case scenario, which is a kind of, let's say, miscalculation, or even, as some worry, the breakout of a third, world war, or even nuclear exchange. Now, I myself don't see this kind of risk happening, neither nuclear exchange, nor actually a World War III. In fact, what I see is already the manifestation of a Cold War 2.0, like I said, between the West on the one side and China and Russia on the other. It's not just China, it's China and Russia. And here, India is going to play a critical role to, like I said, to bridge these two impossible worlds.
Well, certainly there's a rebalancing that is at play here. And the question really is also that is the West increasingly pushing Russia towards China. But there are territorial advances that Russia had recently, just ahead of the elections, if I can call them elections in Russia. And at the same time, the war hasn't seen the last day yet. But Ambassador Gillon, if I can come to you, the second war will enter the 6th month in a few days from now. We've had enough devastation. Of course, India was one of the first countries to condemn the terror attack in southern Israel, which lost, unfortunately, more than 1,400 lives. We saw the gory visuals out there. And immediately after that, Israel went into Gaza to create a new reality, a new Gaza, a new paradigm shift in that area, really. But now, there have been enough violence. More than 29,000 people, according to the local officials at least, who have died. Your assertion, when I interviewed you earlier as well, was that we want to create this new reality and we want to eradicate Hamas, really, because this is really not between Israel and Palestine, this is Israel's fight against Hamas. But what is the end game for Israel? What is this new reality? Who will govern Gaza? And will you at least have a roadmap in the next 6 months?
Yeah, thank you, Aditya. I would say that the goals that we set in the outset have not changed. We put forward two main goals. One is, of course, the release of the hostages. So far, We released some, but there are more than 130 still there. And the other thing is to make sure that Hamas will not have the capacity to repeat its atrocities as it is on October 7, meaning dismantling its military power and its rule of Gaza. So these are the aims. Israel has no ambitions whatsoever to rule Gaza. No one wants to rule Gaza. That's part of the problem. We left Gaza in 2005 in the disengagement. We dismantled about 20 communities. We took out about 10,000 Jews living in the Gaza Strip, and we have no ambition whatsoever to go in. So the long-term thing is hopefully to create a new reality for the Gazans. We are not in war with the people of Gaza, and we want someone else to have the civilian support, the control of their lives there. We unfortunately do not see anyone who can take now the military part of it, so we will have to maintain it until a new reality is created, political reality in Gaza that will enable us also to not to be there from the military point of view.
Thank you so much. Let me get in the former Defense Minister of Maldives, Maria Didi. Now, we have interviewed you very recently about the unfortunate developments that really happened. But in that context, really, we had President's visit to China. We have had some significant statements coming in from him. But there's also the Maldives economy that is suffering immensely, especially in the recent weeks. But traditionally, we've had very good ties, historic cultural ties between India and Maldives. At the same time, we've had a robust defense cooperation. There has been a lot of aid that has been sent to Maldives as well. In this new reality, a new government in power, do you see India and Maldives coming together like before again? Do you think there will be course correction diplomatically and politically that will be done by Maldives? Especially because tourism is one of the biggest sectors out there. And at the same time, the big elephant in the room is China. At a time when the Chinese spy ship through Sri Lanka has moved towards Maldives, where do you see this equation, really? Because China is pretty far from Maldives, and as always known in the last many years, India has been the 911 call for Maldives all the time, and India has displayed brotherhood always. How do you see the relations up ahead?
Interesting question. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's nice to be back in incredible India, a place where I was first introduced to unity in diversity. I did my schooling here, and where I had the first taste for democracy. Now, the question you ask is very interesting, because traditionally in Maldives, we had our defense policy based on foreign policy. And the policy has always been that, we don't encourage aggression. We don't encourage anger. Our first line of defense is diplomacy and dialogue. The second line of defense is also diplomacy and dialogue. And as third and last final thing, we only work as a defense force, the Maldivian defense force. Now, although the present government, which came in very recently, have made very different remarks and acted very different from how we have traditionally been. I mean, any Maldivian government that gets elected, their first point of call is a foreign visit is to New Delhi to visit the Delhi government. But this government has acted different. Now, what is happening is the Indian Ocean has become a hotspot for strategic rivalry. And Maldives, everybody knows Maldives to be this very super holiday destination, famous for its Louis Vuitton of resorts. But the changing strategic environment and strategic rivalry, and also Maldives having through or near its archipelago sea lanes of communication, which makes up about 1/3 of the global commerce. There has been increasing rivalry, and that is affecting the Maldives' domestic politics as well. So we see a shift, but during our administration, we have always had the think that diplomacy, dialogue, keeping good relations with neighbors is what works. I mean, in an era where you all have said, this is not an era of war. This is an era of, and where the topic today is where India can be a global peacemaker, its role. The thing is, we do not want our territory to be a place for proxy wars or anything like that. You know, there was this war in Europe, and it has affected our tourism industry. Ukraine was amongst the 10 top arrivals in Maldives pre-war. Now, we do not have any tourists coming from Ukraine, and that has a significant impact on Maldives. Even otherwise, when there's a war in Europe, certain uncertainties that it creates has impact on Maldives too. So we cannot think of any country that will not be affected, because we are talking about Maldives, a smaller nation because it's a group of islands. But we are still talking about an impact any war anywhere creates on our economies as well. So for us to get into this rivalry and try to take sides is not how we want it to be. As you said, we've always had good ties with India. India has been our first responder, and I believe, will be as well, because it is natural. Look at if you look at our threats, security threats as well, it's all transnational. Climate change, which is an existential threat to us. If something happens to our country, just like the Asian tsunami, the closest neighbor who will come and who can come to help would be India, because we are just about 700 kilometers from Cochin. And if you look at a major oil spill, because the sea lanes of communication goes through or near Maldives, the 8-degree channel has about 16 million barrels of crude oil passing through it. So if there is a major oil spill, just like what happened in Sri Lanka, India was there to help them. Now, a major oil spill like that can be disastrous for Maldives, because we rely on our maritime domain for our livelihood. Let it be the shows where the tourists enjoy their the diving, fishing, whatever you name it. A major oil spill would be disastrous, so we would rely on close neighbors.
Right.
So what I'm saying is, in this era, what you all are saying, when Prime Minister Modi went to Washington, he said he has said it publicly and directly, that this is not an era of war, and diplomacy and dialogue should prevail, and everyone should stop this bloodshed and human suffering. Now, India is part of the United Nations. India is part of the Quad. India is part of SAARC. India is part of the BRICS as well. So they are poised, for being a global peacemaker. And you have publicly said that you do not want to see an era of war. And we Maldivians have always subscribed to peace and stability in the region.
Absolutely. Well, that's the theme of the summit as well, India poised for the next big leap. But Ambassador Akbaruddin, you are someone who has worked very closely with Prime Minister Narendra Modi in different capacities over the last 1 decade. And you've seen the significant shifts that have happened in this foreign policy. India was power push. India being known, recognized, and consulted at the global forums. And particularly, you also dealt with China and Pakistan very closely, especially at the United Nations. Do you see India as this peace catalyst? Do you believe in this statement, axiom of the Prime Minister, not an era of war? Because the reality seems to be very different. Although India has taken a very independent stance, but India's foreign policy, the dynamic change that has really happened, how do you really define this from the SCO to the G20? And also, finally, India coming to the rescue of all stranded Indians, something that hasn't really been talked about as much. From Ukraine, where 22,000 people were stranded, even those Americans and Chinese and others were stranded, but nobody really came to their rescue. At the same time, recently in Qatar, the 8 Navy veterans who were rescued, the unthinkable rescue and release that really happened. How do you define this change in the foreign policy, the dynamic energy that Prime Minister really brings in?
So thank you, Aditya, for giving me an opportunity to engage with you. Let me start by saying that the pursuit of foreign policy is amongst the most difficult pursuits of any public policy. Because we work in an architecture where there is no sovereign, unlike domestic politics where there is sovereign authority. So it's a very competitive field. It's a field where sometimes competition leads to conflict. Doing well in that requires, if I may say, 3 or 4 big things to be ticked off. One, you require domestic stability. No country can take on a greater role if it doesn't have domestic stability. Look at India for the last 10 years. Because domestic stability is the basis for socio-economic growth. We've had good social economic growth. So we've ticked that under Prime Minister Modi. What's the next thing that you would want for a good activist foreign policy? Number 2, I would say, is a leadership which is willing to take risks. And let's not forget, when Prime Minister Modi became the Prime Minister 10 years ago, he had no experience of foreign policy, yet his first big move was something that foreign policy analysts never thought of, including me. I was then in the foreign ministry. He decided to call all South Asian leaders to his inaugural. This was anathema, yet it reflected a willingness to take risks. So in the Prime Minister, we have a leader who's willing to take risks, and over the last 10 years, he's now established himself as a global figure. So you've ticked off another box. What's the third thing that you would require? You require a good tool or instrument of foreign policy in the diplomatic service, and India has always had a diplomatic service which has been well known for its diplomatic prowess. It's now increased in size. It's now becoming more globalist in its nature internally, in the sense we are taking in people from others. So you've ticked 3 boxes. What is left? The 4th box is you need opportunities. And as was said, that this is a period of tumult. This is a period where there are challenges, but amongst challenges have been numerous opportunities. You've listed some of them. So what happens if you have an period of tumult with opportunities? All you need is a willingness to be more active. And a growing India has shown that. When Prime Minister Modi says that this is not an era of war, it doesn't mean that there will not be wars, because wars are endemic, conflict is endemic to the international system. What he means is that there are no solutions that can be brought about by wars. So if there are no solutions that are going to be brought about by wars, you need other solutions, and that perhaps diplomacy, peacemaking, etc. are the way. So I would think, going forward, if India ticks all the 3-4 boxes above and the world is going to be tumultuous, get ready for a more activist foreign policy where India starts shouldering greater public goods. It's not only in terms of our digital infrastructure, but also in terms of peace and security. So I would think down the line, towards the end of this year, you will find a more activist India, more keen to be willing to take on global responsibilities of a kind it has not taken in the past.
If I can just quickly, because we are out of time now, Velina, you recently in Cape Town said that India is a leader of the global South. But where does
Advocate.
Advocate. Where does it put China really? Is China, on the other hand, looking to be the leader of the global North?
Yes, what we are going to witness is a kind of a geoeconomic competition between China and India, and to some extent also Russia, because Russia has still the Soviet networks in many of these countries, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. And if you operate with my scenario, which is, as I said, Cold War 2.0, with a lot of hotspots as we speak, the number of military conflicts and war is the highest since the end of the Cold War, right? So you're going to have more of these hotspots, and of course, a lot of them, unfortunately, are going to happen in the global South. So there will be a dire need for more voices, for those who are voiceless. And here, India is going to present its own narrative. As it was already outlined, it's going to be a narrative of a new power that doesn't have a colonial past. Of course, Russia's narrative is to create actually an anti-imperial, anti-American, anti-colonial narrative, and it has successfully worked in the past, and I argue it will once again successfully work in the future. And China has a geoeconomic competition there. It is about the BRI. A lot of these countries are to some extent indebted, and of course it is about the Chinese presence and the way how China actually understands geostrategy. So what we may see is of course a kind of a competition with obviously non-military means about transport corridors, energy corridors, infrastructure projects, that kind of things. But more so, of course, we will see a bigger push for the G20 as, let's say, counter-narrative to the G7, because the G20 is all about development. So the power that will create a message on development, how development can be steered, let's say, bottom up, not just top down, because Chinese project is top down. This is going to be the most successful formula in my case.
Well, we will be watching that very closely, but quickly to Ambassador Gillon, really, a comment on India. India and Israel are very important strategic partners. We have a very robust defense and technological partnership, but at the same time, India has been at the aid of Palestine as well. We've helped them, we've recently given them a lot of humanitarian aid through Egypt. How do you see this balancing? At the UN as well, India has come to the rescue of Palestine, at the same time believes firmly in the two-state solution.
So I don't see a contradiction here. We all understand that at the end of the day, as was said before, we have to go to for a diplomatic or other solution. What we are doing now is to open the way for such a solution in the future. What India did, I think, from day one, and was led by Honorable Prime Minister Modi, in the afternoon of October 7, he already came out very strongly against the attack and against terrorism. And this was a very persistent view of India all along the way. Speaking of aid, we are also maximizing the support for aid because, as I said before, we have no quarrel with the Palestinian people. Before in the session, someone said a war between Israel and Palestine. It's an utter mistake. It's a war between Israel and an extreme terror organization, ISIS-like, called Hamas. We have no quarrel with the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian people. So aid to the Palestinians is our interest as much as anyone else's. When it comes to a political solution, what will be the political solution? It's a big question. For a two-state solution, you need a strong and credible partner on the other side. I must say that so far the Palestinian Authority did not prove themselves as such. We just go back to 2005 when Israel left Gaza to the Palestinian Authority. In 2006, they lost the elections to Hamas, and 2007 kicked out by force. So we have to make sure, and what happened since then, a failed state was created in Gaza, which attacked Israel over the years. It wasn't once or twice. We were attacked periodically. Deterrence that was mentioned here, the more we created deterrence, we had a little bit more time of peace and quiet. But what happened on October 7 is a watershed. It's not the same skirmishes or small wars. This is a full-fledged war, and that's why Hamas has to be out of the picture, because you cannot deal with these extreme fundamentalists. They are not looking for a two-state solution. They are looking for the extinction of the State of Israel, as was mentioned by the Honorable Prime Minister. Iran is just the supreme leader just a couple of days ago again spoke of the annihilation of Israel off the map. I don't know any other country that is threatened to be destroyed. So I don't see any problem with the fact that India is supporting a political solution at the end, diplomatic, political. We are also looking for that, and now giving humanitarian and standing strong against terrorism.
Fair enough. India, of course, stands against terrorism. There have been several statements that have been made, and one gentleman who's on the panel, Syed Akbaruddin, has been very vociferous at the UN, and that brings us to the end, unfortunately, of this panel, because we are out of time. And, you know, of course, on terrorism, India stands against it. There is perhaps time for UN reforms as well, reforms at the UN permanent membership level as well. And Prime Minister's words, not an era of war, really resonating out there. And perhaps we are looking towards India increasingly putting up a very dynamic phase, a new role as a global peace conflict in the coming months and years. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us.